Good to see each one this evening. We have some visiting with us. We want you to feel especially welcome. We're glad for the presence of each one. This is the second effort to finish this outline, part B, I guess, of congregational cooperation. Last time we emphasized especially the cooperation pattern that we find in Scripture in evangelism. The principle that is often trampled is seen in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. If that's followed, about 90% of the problems are stymied. That just can't get past the requirement that elders specifically, and specific, as we pointed out, is a type of authority that excludes. It specifies that the extent of the authority of elders is to be the flock which is among you. You exercise the oversight over this flock, not over that one or part of that one. You don't surrender part of yours to another. You don't have a super congregation that oversees at least part of the work of hundreds of congregations. Each congregation oversees the flock which is among them. Now there may be some questions about relationships. We find a group starts a new congregation out of what's sometimes called the home congregation. Probably not a good idea. They're all independent. And the elders here, where they came from, may decide, the folks I know, they came from us, and we can tell them what they ought to do. And that's not appropriate. Sometimes people react, maybe they're being cautious, maybe overcautious. Somebody sins in the congregation, you go to them and talk to them, take 2 or 3 with you. They don't like that, they're not about to repent, they just jump up and leave. Go to another congregation nearby. Well, I think it's appropriate to let them know what can be established, not spreading rumors, without telling them what to do. You can let them know what the facts are and then back off and let them decide what to do. But the principle that we see here has problems in both directions, doing too much and not doing enough. But the oversight is exclusively, specifically, the flock which is among them. And if it violates that principle, it's wrong. We talked about some of the specific violations that have been rampant among some of our brethren, where churches turn their funds over to the sponsoring church. It began a number of years ago with the Herald of Truth, but has developed in all directions, so that instead of following the pattern of sending the money to the evangelist, which is what we find in the New Testament, they send it to a super church, or super eldership, or super organization in the past, especially with the benevolent societies, or that is evangelistic societies, missionary societies. Here you have a missionary society in the eldership. They're overseeing more than their local work. The sending churches are sending less, are overseeing less than the work that's being done. And while we can see problems with that, the main problem is it's not the pattern, which Christians must follow, and which the Bible emphasizes over and over again. We showed the developing mess. That didn't show up this time, did it? That happens when you ignore that principle of overseeing all of the work among you. And we spent some time describing this picture a number of years ago of dollars that are running in all directions and being counted about 14 times before they finally actually pay for something. But this kind of inefficient, absurd mess is not like what you find in the New Testament. Now, again, we look at this and we say, all right, this is not sufficient, that is efficient. I can see that. And that helps, but that's not the main reason why we ought to be against this. The main reason is what?
It's not scriptural.
It's not according to the pattern. Right. It's obviously ineffective and inefficient and just doesn't make good sense. But that's not the primary reason. It helps us appreciate the primary reason. One church never sent to another church for evangelism in the New Testament. They obviously could have. But the pattern that we see is they always sent to the evangelist. And as we pointed out, the difference here in the pattern with evangelism and that in benevolence is that each church is equal to the responsibility to preach the gospel to the world. It's not this church's work as opposed to that, or more this one than that one. They're all equal, and if they're going to be autonomous, independent, sufficient, as we have emphasized, then you don't put one church in charge of 100 churches' work. You don't have the super churches. And they can cooperate as per the pattern. But as we think back about that tabernacle and all of the chapters of minute specifications, and then God telling the brethren, the Hebrews chapter 10, make all things. Remember what Moses said, was told, make all things according to the pattern. And if you're familiar with the way that's described in the Old Testament, that's pretty heavy. He spent a lot of time telling them exactly what to do. We know what happens when they didn't do it exactly right. Now then, to Christians, you make all things according to the pattern. The church is the house of God today, just as the temple and initially the tabernacle was the house of God then. And if the church is doing the work, then the church needs to follow the pattern. All right, any questions, comments, additional ideas? Yes, sir.
I'm sure you've heard the example, but it just shows the absurdity of it. One church doing all the evangelism, all the other churches wants to stop another church from setting up we're going to do all the singing for all the congregations. You send us your money, and we'll do all your singing.
You pretty well got that in a place or two.
Really?
The frustrating part is they got a lot to offer, and they help the singing, but send us the money and let us do it. They're really not doing that. But they've taken on the work of training for the churches. Now, turning money over to them so they can do it for them is not quite to that point, but it's in that direction. We could use some help, and some do a good job, and just need to make sure they do it scripturally. And that's a challenge when you're teaching on this subject, that many times we who are determined to follow the pattern don't always appreciate it as much as we should. I say that cautiously because there are some that do a great job. But I've been able to talk to some of these people who are not following the pattern exactly as they ought to. whose enthusiasm and sacrifice and determination make us look pretty sad as a whole. I mentioned the church out in San Angelo, raising about $75,000 every fifth Sunday to preach the gospel around the world. And I see my brethren saying, well, we've got to make sure we do it scripturally, and what are they doing around the world? And some of them really are not interested. I mean, I'm talking not about all by any means, but I'm just interested in right here, and this is all I care about. And I've heard that, and I compare that with, at this congregation, there are about 12 families a year that, at their own expense, travel around the world to be at the places where they're supported, whether it's in Russia or Armenia or Czech Republic. And they spend a week to 2 weeks there meeting the people, and they come back, stand before the congregation with tears in their eyes and tell them what's going on and what their money is doing. They're interested in preaching the gospel. I think we need more of that. Maybe we can look, unfortunately, at some who are not always doing it scripturally, for at least examples in fervor and enthusiasm and sacrifice and determination to preach the gospel around the world. We're interested in following the pattern. That's wonderful. But you remember, Jesus says, worship in spirit and in truth. Well, we want to make sure we got the truth. Let's make sure we got the spirit too. We need both. That enthusiasm and fervor doesn't excuse any deviation from the pattern. But at the same time, we're following the pattern. We can brush our hands and say, see, I'm following the pattern without the fervor and dedication, determination to do the work. We got to do both. Okay, I'm off of my soapbox here, so let's back to the pattern. This is the sufficient organization for preaching the gospel to the world. There's nothing bigger or smaller. God thought this would do the job, and that's all He authorized. And they can cooperate by sending money to the preacher that needs help. Any other questions, comments, observations? Now, next question. Can churches scripturally cooperate in benevolence? And as we look to the New Testament, the answer is yes. They did, and the pattern was different from evangelism. You do find one church sending to another church, and the circumstance is different in that they are not equal, in that this one would have an abundance, this one would have a need. And it is given so that they can be equal. Again, Hebrews 8, Moses was warned, we make all things according to the pattern. That's the pattern. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, I think, very specifically, pointedly, gives us the pattern in benevolence. We see it illustrated in a number of other cases, but here are the fundamental principles. As he's encouraging them to give to brethren in Judea, where there was a famine. This is not for the ease of others and for your affliction, but by way of equality, which is the underlying principle that we saw illustrated in evangelism. You look at this picture where we had dollars going in all directions before. Those churches weren't equal. here were some super churches and hundreds of churches sending their money to them. Maybe some of these churches sending their money are sacrificing to do that to a church that's got more money to know what to do with. They sometimes have a struggle figuring out where to send it. This is not the way it's supposed to be, Paul says.
What's that verse again?
Do I have that down wrong? 2 Corinthians 11:13.
For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming
That's the wrong place. Okay. We got a typo. Which one am I looking for? Thank you for pointing that out. All right, that phrase. I've got a different version from the one I'm looking at. Let me go. That sounds correct.
Yeah, that's it.
I got 11. Thank you. All right, just imagine that it's 2 Corinthians 8. You're going to see 11 pop up for several more verses here, or more versions of this. Sorry, and thank you for the correction. The principle is equality. At this present time, now he's not saying this is the way you do this from now on. He's saying the opposite. This is temporary because the need is temporary, and the situation that makes one in need and the other in abundance is a temporary situation, part of which they will correct. And so it's temporary. Your abundance being a supply for their need. So there is an unequal situation, which is not the way it is in evangelism. Here in benevolence, one is in need, one in abundance. So for this time, so that you can have equality, then you have one sending to the other. Also, your abundance may also supply, if the thing reverses, so that their abundance in a future state, they're in need now, but it may be a situation where their abundance may become a supply for your need. It can reverse itself depending on who's in need and who's in abundance. So that he emphasizes this is temporary. This is not a permanent situation. The principle, again, is repeated that there may be equality. Now that's a theme that you see throughout this section. And that we emphasize when we're talking about evangelism. The principle of equality, and when that's violated, you've got a serious problem. In evangelism, they're all equally related to the responsibility of preaching the gospel of the word. They're not equally related to the fact that you've got a family in Judea. And so in order to produce equality, the one in abundance sends to the one in need. And then if there's a famine back over here in Philippi, then the money goes the other way, and it's temporary, peculiar to the situation. That there may be equality, as it's written. Okay, here's an example from the Old Testament, so that they can, one of the problems in using examples from the Old Testament is we don't know as much as we ought to about the Old Testament, but Paul again and again will go back to the principles that we see illustrated there. He who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. Now what's he talking about here? The manna. This was amazing stuff. Not only provided the nourishment for probably a couple of million people, and answers in these I think, absurd objections that we hear over and over again from the archaeologists. You know, there's no way to take care of all these people out in the desert. They couldn't find enough to eat. That's right. And it was that way so that they could understand this was God providing for them, and they couldn't do it by themselves. That was one of the points. And those archaeologists just totally missed that. But miraculously, if they hoarded that, what would happen? They tried to store up more than they needed. It'd turn rotten, and they'd have a mess on their hands. And if you got some that just didn't quite, maybe they had the flu or something, couldn't get out and get quite enough, got some, they would have enough. And if others gathered more than they needed, it just kind of disappeared. Unless they were trying to hoard it and it got rotten. But here was an equalizing factor that God built into the distribution of manna. And he says, that's like what we're doing here, because you've got the abundance, they've got the need. Let's fix that and equalize it so that there may be equality. So, I will affirm that the cooperation pattern in benevolence, the pattern, is first, it's temporary. Paul says, now at this time. The conditions, one is in abundance, one is in need. There is an unequal situation that needs a remedy. And the goal is to remedy that so that there may be equality, just as was the case in the Old Testament with the manna. Now, that's the pattern, and not just the pattern that we see illustrated, but the principles are clearly stated in the passage we just looked at. And if that's followed, I mean, it's just ignored. Because here's a church that's just got all kinds of money. You send it to them, they'll take care of the need for everybody else. The one receiving is the one in need, not the one. They have reversed the pattern. When the super churches try to take over and do the work for the little churches, well, they don't have as much. They can do what they can do, and that's all they're accountable for. But the pattern is illustrated this way. One church is in abundance, one is in need. They're not equal. And so, one is a sending church, the other is a receiving church. And what's the goal? Equality. That there may be equality, which is being trampled when you violate the pattern. Little churches send them to the big churches so they can do big work. Now, I can understand big churches wanting to do big things in big ways, and that's the way the human mind works. That's not the way God's mind works, and his pattern is different. And he anticipates in the same passage that the situation may turn around so that your abundance may be a supply for their need if the need changes. They exchange places, abundance and need, so that the goal can be met, that there may be equality. Now, yes, sir.
My point of what you're saying here is the only way that God will fulfill his promise to take care of us, and he made that promise, is by means of each other taking care. When we are in need, when I'm in need, you take care of me. When you're in need, I take care of you. It's, in other words, that particular process is how God's providential hand functions. And if we pull back his hand, when we say, and I mean by pattern, then that promise goes away. You're going to be dependent upon a social structure. You have all kinds of issues and problems that fall apart.
You wind up with this. And this is not that. One is specified, the other is what develops when you trample God's principles. We didn't start out with a Catholic hierarchy right out of the box. Somebody didn't just decide to do that one day. It just gradually developed because that simple principle, each eldership oversee all of the work of the flock, which is among them. You can't go any further than that. It's just a local congregation, and that's it. And it is not under anything or over anything. There's just not anything else in the Bible as a functional arrangement through which God would have his work done. When you break that wall down, then it just goes in all directions, whether you're talking about evangelism or benevolence. This was not all, well, this is both, isn't it? We've got both benevolence and evangelism diagrammed here with basically three super churches, hundreds of churches sending each one sending back and forth to the other. Yes.
It starts with one church violating that hand of God, that pattern.
Yeah.
And when that happened, and we were talking about this earlier, the things that are happening around us in churches, that when that began, we see the years after, but we haven't seen what's going to happen to the entertainment or the amenities that are going to be offered. We haven't seen that yet. I don't know what that's going to look like. It's starting to change.
Look at the denominations around us, and you got a pretty good idea. You go to church, it's a concert. It'll rival the rock concerts. Well, the attitudes are different with people who want to do what the book says. And just one more lick on that. Just because we're doing what the book says doesn't mean we're doing all we ought to be doing either. But we need to do both, worship in spirit and in truth. But this, we can see, is wrong and certainly different from the pattern. When you object to this, what happens? They'll lie about you. You don't believe in cooperation. Like if you insist on singing and making melody in your heart, then you don't believe in music. Or you insist that the Holy Spirit does not work directly to convert people, then you don't believe in the Holy Spirit. Or that you can't use the Old Testament to authorize worship today, you don't believe in the Old Testament. If you think the church is sufficient to do benevolent work, you don't believe you don't believe in orphans. You ever heard that? I hear it all the time. Yes.
Comment for me. There's a congregation in Maumelle, and they have an eldership, and they only are in charge of their congregation. They do the teaching, they do the preaching. Comment on that. They're responsible for that congregation, and they don't support an evangelist locally. Have money that they take in. I think evangelists go out, but they believe the pattern is the elders teach and are responsible for their own congregation. I've worshiped there a couple of times there.
But they don't believe in a local evangelist?
Yeah, I guess it's what it means because when we went, the elder taught the class, and there were no children's classes, I don't believe, and they took turns teaching or preaching.
Well, they're not doing what we're talking about here, but if, I don't know of any preachers that are not located somewhere. This dislocated preacher idea is a fiction. I think elders often need to do more. But I have seen.
I don't think they're paid. I think they're responsible for that flock, and they take turns giving the lesson for the day or teaching the Bible class that day.
A factor they miss is there's at least as much about paying preachers as there is about paying, paying elders as there is about paying preachers in the New Testament. We've got a lesson cooking before we'll be dealing with some of that. But paying elders would be fine. And elders teaching certainly is doing exactly what they ought to do. But if they oppose evangelist teaching, I mean, there's just dozens of examples of that where Paul stayed for 3 years. It was especially needful for apostles to get around because they didn't have New Testaments then. And they
Would you
needed.
say that's a pattern that's acceptable?
What's that?
Would you say their worship is acceptable? The elders are probably in charge of their flock.
We find brethren at Galatia that were binding concepts that were not scriptural. It sounds like that's involved. If they're binding the idea that you can't have an evangelist that will stay there for any period of time, that's violating the pattern and binding something that's not scriptural. I would oppose that. If they had a paid eldership, that would be fine. That wouldn't really relate to the responsibility to support evangelists. But I think we need more of that. I know of elders who do a great job of teaching, and some, frankly, don't have that much ability, but they've got great abilities in other areas. They may be really good one-on-one, but they can't stand the pulpit. Or at least they might be able to develop that, but it's not there. I've mentioned Donnie Lott. Some of you have heard me talk about him. Donnie, I'm sorry, I'd just say, let somebody else get up and do the preaching, Donnie. But turn him loose one-on-one, and he's unbeatable. People have different abilities, so they don't all have to be evangelists. And so elders can complement each other. I've seen elderships where he's not that great a public teacher, but he's really good at teaching privately. And others are good at other things. And you get 3 or 4 of them together and they fill in each other's weak spots and make a very effective unit. That doesn't mean you can ignore if they're in violation of some of the requirements, that can't be ignored or made up otherwise. But I would have problems with their making some rules that are contrary to the pattern. Now, I need to know more about it. I don't know a thing in the world about it, except what you just told me. So I'd be glad to listen.
There's a nice building out there. They have a very nice building.
Yeah.
Very few members, but because they were in Mom Allen, we visited a couple of times, and that was their structure, that was their pattern. Communion was just like normal.
We have some brethren who seem to be very devoted, sometimes have nice buildings. They don't believe in classes, and they just insist not to do
But
that.
they had classes, but not for children.
Yeah.
They had children in amongst the.
Some require that the cup that's specified in the New Testament is not what they drank, but what they held, which I think is contrary to the New Testament. And so they're against this and against that, and that they need to be taught, and sometimes can't. I had a debate a number of years ago with a congregation in Panama City where I was preaching that opposed classes and individual cups. And we had a good discussion. I went fishing with the preacher that we debated several times. Get out there and in the boat, he couldn't run off. We had some really good discussions, a good debate, and restored fellowship with the congregations. Maybe it's just a matter of sitting down and talking and teaching. You don't have to skin them alive, but the brethren, let's see if we can teach them. Other questions? Good questions.